It's World NGO Day today, and we have two guests who are joining us in the studio. Dr. John Kitui is a country director at Oxfam, Kenya, and we have Ibrahim Ahmed, who's a convener of the ASAL Humanitarian Network and also the chairman of the Kenya Chapter for Change Working Group. Chapter for Change Working Group. Charter for Change, rather, the Kenya Charter for Change Working Group. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Eric.
Karibuni sana to Kenya's biggest conversation. Happy World NGO Day.
Thank you very much.
The two of you. And to celebrate your coming to join us, CT has the day's proverb.
Our proverbs for the whole of this week are from the country of Uganda. Being Kenyans, we all know where Uganda is, don't we? Even if you haven't been there, you have an idea of which direction it's at. Huh? The beautiful, this proverb starts, are like a dog with big, beautiful eyes. Might turn out to be a thieving dog or a good hunter.
The beautiful are like a dog with
beautiful eyes.
Beautiful eyes. Might turn out to be a thieving dog or
a good hunter.
A good hunter.
Yes.
Dr. Kitui, what do you understand from that proverb?
Don't judge a dog by its beauty.
Well said. Well said. Abdi, do you agree?
Largely, in my community, we don't really have a lot of dogs. But definitely, it means by just looking at it, that will not tell you whether it is a really hunting dog or not. So just joke with it, and then it will show you what it is made of. That's how I see.
Put it to the test.
Yes.
Also, beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. If you are a hunter, probably beauty means differently to if you just are a pet owner.
Or if you're the prey.
Or if you're the prey also.
Okay. World NGO Day. What does it mean?
So, World NGO Day is celebrated on the 27th of February. And it's just to celebrate the contribution of the non-profit sector within society, both from the services it provides in humanitarian work to save lives, but also to empower groups that feel marginalized to wrestle for power within systems. For example, you look at the history of like the labor unions and the trade unions. These are the biggest civil societies that started off when industry was not necessarily working for the labor force, and it was mainly working for shareholders. So labor unions have been there as a civil society for a very, very long time to struggle for that space as well. Then when you come to societies where many people are being left behind, you find like civil society organizations or and non-governmental organizations are there to make sure that people live with dignity, their rights are protected, their freedoms are enjoyed. So most of the things we take for granted today, whether it's our freedoms, our liberties, our right of association, our right for fair wages, freedom to life itself, freedom from slavery, freedom from sexual and gender-based violence, whatever it is that we take for granted, a lot of these things have been thanks to the non-governmental organizations. So this day is set aside to celebrate the immense contribution of the non-profit sector in our societies.
So you're using very many words here interchangeably. Non-governmental organizations, non-profit organizations. One and the same thing?
So it's a semantics. So when you talk about non-governmental organizations, strictly speaking, even the private sector will be part of that as well. But when we talk about non-governmental organizations, I think we are usually referring to the civil society organizations, as opposed to just a very blanket statement about non-governmental organizations that would include private sector, for example. So in this instance, the focus is on this civil society organizations.
Many people, when they hear civil society, they think of advocates, right? So those that are involved in advocacy, whether it's rights, whether it's governance and all. And then they also draw another line between civil society and humanitarian organizations.
It's a false dichotomy. So probably the best way to look at it is to look at it from a continuum perspective. So we have civil society organizations ranging from, as I mentioned earlier, the labor unions, the trade unions. Then we have some that push for freedoms and rights, whether it's right to life or right to from non-violence. And then you have the other ones who provide services where either the state is not providing services like health services, and then you get church-based civil society organizations providing that healthcare to the communities, or providing water or sanitation, or communities just coming together and organizing themselves around restoration of a forest or trying to meet the needs of their communities. These are civil society organizations. So it's a myriad range of organizations on a very lengthy continuum, one would say.
Let me bring you in, Ahmed Ibrahim Abdi. You're the convener of the ASAL Humanitarian Network. ASAL here is the arid and semi-arid lands. So we can clearly ask you, so where do you focus your attention on? it's obvious. But tell us about the network. What is it about, and what do you focus on mainly?
The network, which is called ASAL Humanitarian Network, was born out of caucuses and being able to bring people or actors all at different locations so that we could amplify our voice jointly of our wider geographical area. The ASAL areas, as you know, are frequently exposed to impacts of natural or man-made crises, and these has come in a cyclic way. So as a individual local NGO, you will not really be able to achieve what you want to do at scale and to be able to influence so many others. So what we do, a wide range of issues. Each of the different members, which now we are 30 only, but we are still finalizing the governance setups, and we are just a platform. It's not a registered entity. It is a platform to bring the different voices together from across the board. The 30 include around 11 women rights and women-led organizations. These organizations, some of them date back to the late 1989, when I remember in those ages there was also a crisis, and so many people had come dropped off and displaced from their normal way of life out in the pastoral setups and back into settlements, and they had nothing, women, children, elderly. And from that moment, organizations started working alongside the government, and even before, as John has already put. But some of these organizations now have been doing things related to humanitarian aid. We do things related to active citizenship, which is related to governance. We have been doing things related to constitutionalism, deepening and rooting democracy. We are also working in the space of peace and conflict issues. We also work in the development arena, from food security, water, other aspects, including even education. So it's a wide group of people, but when we came together, we really said, how can we be able to have a locally led model where we are going to influence an effective humanitarian aid system that does not disrupt the development agenda in a continuum of a nexus approach. So that is what brought us together, and way back in 2015, we jointly did it on our own, and then we looked at it in 2019. We woke up from with another crisis of drought. So from 2019 of drought, then we had 2020 floods, then we had locust, then the COVID. Now we are talking about a deepening drought crisis. And this is not what the different actors should just be experiencing. We should jointly be doing these things. That's why now the network of 30 local organizations, which we are expecting to expand to the 23 ASAL counties, and in the long run have the different regions. So networks from the coastal area, the western and side, plus the urban poor, including the mountain region from a climate change perspective. In the long run, we would like to really push this agenda jointly, and we'll be opening up the movement to those locations in the near future.
So we're looking at NGOs across the board, serving in a complementary capacity to government, without wanting to disrupt anything, kind of like what you've said. So now let's look at one of the issues that is biting. We can sit here and pontificate about how bad the drought is. Oh, it's bad, and people are suffering, and people are, dying. How bad is it? Because here we are from a point of there are non-governmental organizations who have been working in the last few years towards mitigation, who've been working towards relief, helping our government, essentially. How bad are we looking at the situation right now with the drought?
Thank you very much. First, if you really look, let me just take you back to 2 steps. In 2010, 2011, the Horn of Africa as a general was experiencing some famine. Around 250,000 children died. From that moment, a number of organizations came together and they have been pushing. We don't need to delay. So from a dangerous delay perspective of waiting until a crisis thickens. And we see death is the time now action takes place. There's need to do action earlier. So in 2017 crisis, again, the same was averted as a result of the concerted effort of local, national, and the humanitarian community together with the government, that we did not see deaths across the Horn of Africa, if you really talk about it. Now we are talking about the 6th one is in March, failed below, and in essence, from a spatial, how the rain is distributed, below normal rainfalls. From 6, and the first one of the 2010, 2011, we were only talking about 3. Now we are in 6. And without the timely, appropriate support, the NGOs, the CSOs, and government coming together has really put on the ground with better mechanisms to really respond to the crisis, then we are seeing literally not so much deaths. But as we speak now, if the humanitarian situation is not responded to very fast, in the next 2-3 months, we'll be witnessing serious and mass deaths of children, elderly, and sick. Let me just give you a top look at the analysis that was recently done, and even the President of the Republic of Kenya really launched the other day. We are talking about 5.4 million in ASAL counties, 23 ASAL counties. That represents almost 10 or 11 or 12% of the Kenyan population that are in crisis. If you really look at the 10 ASAL counties, the ASAL humanitarian and really network works, 63% of those people in crisis come from that place. And if you look at the analysis of each of those counties, 6 in every 10 is really facing crisis and emergency level, acute. That is acute food insecurity.
Right.
The best a person can get is a meal a day.
That's the best.
The best. Others who have been seriously, we are seeing serious displacements. People are coming to settlements because they have lost what they had. You know, a means of life is that livestock.
Yeah.
It's just like you going into a shamba or a farm and you can cut out nothing. So these animals are not wet, so there's no milk. The body conditions are in bad shape, and therefore you cannot slaughter. Families who are reporting close to 140 cows dead for a family that is of 6-8 is serious. So where does that individual get any extra thing? So if 6 in 10 are in that kind of a situation, then we are really in dire situation. And it will be unfortunate if Kenya, which is a country of a 3 billion budget,
Trillion.
3 trillion budget, cannot even put 10% into losses of livestock that can be said to be 300 billion to 500 billion being lost in those periods. So it's serious and serious.
Ahmed, in 2021, President Uhuru Kenyatta declared drought a national emergency, right?
Yes.
A national disaster. What did that mean? Did you see any change in government response to what was happening in the ASAL areas?
If I really look at how the government really normally responds, we have a set of a social protection structure. The social protection structure in maybe 4 counties giving to the hunger safety net. around 100,000 families were supposed to be given bi-monthly 5,400. We also have around 1.2 million in the Inua Jamii, which get 2,000. As the crisis now thickens, we anticipate also that those groups are not also left behind, because we are given 2,000 shillings, or you are given 5,400 in every 2 months, which is 2,700. Then you still cannot be able to really make anything. But from that time the drought crisis was done to now, those people under the hunger and safety net are talking of maybe having, when we talk to them, they're saying they only received 2 cycles of like that. That is 10,800 in 2022, which they should have received 4 cycles. So that 1 cycle didn't happen. We have, the government had put around 7 point something, 2 point something in livestock offtake, and some other was announced as at that time. How much of it really came out is not clear. So it will be really great to know how much of it came out. The government of the day also promised to put 6 billion more this year. We are talking about a humanitarian crisis with an appeal from the humanitarian. If you look at the UN dashboard right now, we are in need of $300 million. It's only 54%.
$300 million to address the hunger crisis in Kenya or the whole of
Kenya
Africa?
only.
Just Kenya alone?
Kenya alone, which is now only 54% funded, and largely most of this response happened in 2022.
Where does that leave us then? City, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm looking at this discussion, and why I'm quiet, because I'm just playing this thing in my head. All the areas that we refer to as the ASAL areas belong to counties. Agriculture is a devolved function. 2.4% of our budget in this country is devoted to agriculture, whether it's fisheries, whether it's livestock, whether it's crop management, abattoirs, husbandry, whatever you want to call it. Now, my question is now, the national government is supposed to be in charge of policy, okay? How much of this money that is allocated actually goes to the counties? Before we even discussing what the counties can do. Yes, it's 2.4%. We've got a 3 trillion shilling budget, okay? One can do the maths. How much of this money actually goes to the counties? And when it does, what does the counties do with it? Because the moment you have a county government and there's a problem within your county, it's a national crisis, yes, but we can segment it into counties and say, okay, there's this county, and there's the other. How much of the monies that the counties actually get have they actually put towards resolving these very, very same things that you are saying?
So you have to go back to 2013, and the central government transferred a lot of the subsectors you mentioned, whether it's fisheries, horticulture, all of the to the counties. But to date, most of the budget of the 2.4 budget remains at the Kilimo House. And that's a tragedy of what we're talking about in agriculture. First of all, it's underfunded. So for a country that prides itself in saying agriculture is the backbone of this economy, and Muga, you can correct me, probably it's not, probably the financial sector is. I think the agriculture sector has been the backbone of our food security for a very, very long time. We grow food across the country, and that's given. But we only put in 2.4%, as opposed to the 10% that the African countries have committed to. But the 2.4% also remains at the moment at Kilimo House. And that's part of the problem. That's why you see the death of the agricultural extension services, for example. They're non-existent. And probably the 2.4% goes to paying the operational costs, the salaries of people sitting behind their desks, without necessarily any even transport or facilitation to reach the farmers, for example. So that's partly the problem. But the other problem that we have to acknowledge is the impact of climate change on our agricultural food systems, because we are a rain-fed agriculture economy. Whether it's a pastoralist or the guys who do farming in the Western Kenya, wherever, we depend on the rain. And we've cut our water towers. There's been a very lazy policy on really addressing climate change. And not just in Kenya, we can look at the region, but also at the global level. And because the climate change effects that we see in Kenya are not necessarily our own creation. Partly they are, but in Africa, I think it's assumed when you look at the 10 worst climate-affected areas, they only contribute about 0.1% of the global carbon footprint or the carbon, but then we suffer the worst consequences on the climate impact. So there's a global also justice there around climate change. So I think for me that's kind of, when you talk about agriculture, is we have a very fundamental basics we need to meet. But the crisis we are seeing is not just an agriculture crisis, but also it's not a climate crisis also. We have to really talk about the role inequality contributes to the misery and the crisis and the starvation of the people in the arid and semi-arid lands. And I say that because, and do mention the issue of, with Kenya really, why are we even talking about the drought? Because like people should not be dying or starving in a country like Kenya. We are a very rich country. We are a very wealthy country compared to other countries as well. There are even drier places in this continent. You can go to Algeria, you can go to Morocco, you can go to the Middle East.
There are countries on this planet which are predominantly desert.
But no one is dying of starvation. That anyone should die from starvation is actually a political failure. If the government did its job in making sure that the social protection system worked, in a year where the drought is so severe, the worst we've seen in like 40 years or 70 years, depending on who you refer to, the government putting 0.25 of its budget over 2 years. I think the 15 billion you are quoting here, give and take, is between 2021 and 2022 and 2023. In a country that allocates 3.3 trillion Kenya shillings in a budget, giving 6 billion, I think you have to look at it from its scale. You're missing the point, really. When you're talking about, yes, we've declared this a national disaster, why are we putting 0.25
But then
the budget?
if indeed those are the figures and the reality you present are our realities, then when I look at the caucus that our brother Abdi here has mentioned, it's a big caucus. It has many influential organizations within it. So what then should be the focus? Because the people who have the might to help solve this problem is the government.
Absolutely.
Okay. And the reason why they have the might is because we pay taxes.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, this money, even these very people who are really burdened with the problems we're talking about, pay their taxes. They pay their dues. How much pressure, how much time and pressure does the group lend itself to in focusing on how to get the government, how to get the legislators, how to ensure that this money which we say keeps sitting in Kilimo House, because we hear the same story with the Ministry of Health. You have a problem and you're being told the money is at the national headquarters. Surely,
What is it doing there?
maybe it's looking for the cows at the headquarters. I don't know. But the point is, should that not be the focus? Because all these areas have county governments, they have governors, they have legislators, they have all these people. What are they doing to ensure that the appropriate pressure is applied on the government so that what needs to be done is actually done?
So the question is on leadership.
Yes.
The leaders from these counties, and then being able to canvass and lobby the other leaders from the other counties, so that as national leaders you speak about the same issue.
Yes.
And focus on what is actually happening. Let's talk about that after we take this break. 28 minutes to 9. We are celebrating World NGO Day 2023 today, and Dr. John Kitui, who is the country director for Oxfam Kenya, is here with us in the studio. And Ahmed Ibrahim Abdi, who is a convener for the ASAL Humanitarian Network, is also here.
This is the Situation Room the only way to start your day.
Our guests, Dr. John Kitui from Oxfam and Ahmed Ibrahim Abdi from the ASAL Humanitarian Network. Abdi, respond to the question that City asked before we took the break. What is it that your organization, the organizations under your network, have been doing to engage with your local leaders so this matter is mainstreamed at national level?
We have been really coming with the data. We have created a number of press sessions. We have lined up a number of roundtables with the leaders from our region. Some of the key issues which, when we discuss with them, like the county governments, as we speak, every year, a quarter of the budget is not there.
What do you mean not there?
Let's say we have four quarters.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you're reaching towards the end of the year, and now up to maybe from the period of March.
From March to June.
To June period is the time when, the last two is when you get most of the resources. So in the end, when a budget is read to September period, nothing much is flowing. So from that kind of a perspective, then you'll find that, yes, we are saying funds are available. When it has been released, it's late in time. If you look at the spending even levels, and you're hearing some of the county governments are really returning money because money is coming at the last 6 months.
From next month, we'll start seeing counties being very busy.
So from that kind of a way of really how funding flows really happen, and in the processes of allocations, a quarter, I mean, one of the
first quarter goes to waste.
It disappears, or maybe it's not brought on time. 60% to 70% of the budgets are going to administration, salaries, and things related to that.
Are you saying this is a common pattern? That
yes, across.
Right, from the time we had devolution, 47 counties, this is what we see.
Yes.
So then why don't we plan with that in mind, since you know this is the pattern?
Yes, so from that kind of a really setup, is devolution really working? It's time to really push and work around the next steps and analyzing, reviewing how to really devolution. Let me give you an example. For those 5.4 million people who are said to be in crisis, they don't find themselves in public participation processes. Why? It's been done in town halls, in settlements. If largely the ASAL areas are inhabited by agro-pastoralists who are walking around to farms a bit far away with livestock here and there, when do they? So
they'll never participate.
Are they really being part of these processes that really meet the needs of their priorities?
Ahmed,
so from that perspective, we, in terms of now engaging with the different governments at different levels, the legislatures definitely is from these roundtables and this. At the county level, we engage with these different groups. Up to the grassroots level, we try and bring their priorities together. Then we help them how to do memorandums of memorandums to sign up. They get people who amongst them can come to the far-flung locations where public participation is happening, and this is where we're putting the thing.
But I think, really, Ahmed, the question I think that Muga was asking is, for example, we've seen a supplementary budget that has been passed in Parliament now, being proposed to Parliament, and very little funds have been allocated to the drought response when 5.4 million people from these counties are affected. I think the question one would ask is, what is the legislatures from these counties doing in Parliament? Why are they passing this supplementary budget or not putting pressure to the executive or to the planners to allocate more resources, to just do what it's the role of the government to do? Because I think if they did their role as parliamentarians, as representatives of the people, probably would not see the scale of devastation we are currently seeing in these areas.
Why don't they even lobby their fellow MPs? Because this is something that's affecting the whole country. Okay?
Yeah.
The assumption that just because someone comes from the ASAL area, they don't have relatives in Nyanza, where I come from. They do. Okay?
You can lobby.
So, a national crisis shouldn't be left in the hands of the legislators who come from the ASAL areas. Even those who don't particularly understand it should be lobbied. It should be a national issue. I am simply saying this, that we have a situation in this country that seems to have become normalized, where the interest of those who really need the help is completely disregarded. And what seems to be the focus is talk of really massive, huge projects with billions and billions of shillings. And yet, there are people who cannot even have a meal a day, and the numbers are growing. Now, if that seems to be the direction, then those who perhaps, as we say, who are wearing the shoe and know where it pinches, they need to shout the loudest. And need to get other people to shout equally loudly with them.
If I may ask, on the answer, I'm just going back to non-governmental organizations, because I think this is crucial in this thing that CT has just mentioned. What was the agreement? And I ask that because, okay, so with the entrance or invitation of non-governmental organizations, was there the agreement that we're going to have a symbiotic relationship whereby you're going to help us out here? You're going to go sometimes where we can because government may be stretched thin. And then when you see that there's something that's going all right, you know, let us know so we can see how to hold our hands together. And then you will push us every now and then when it's needed. Is that the kind of thing that we have agreed? I mean, of course, in layman terms here, you know, treaties and such not quoted. Is that not kind of like what has been agreed of the working relationship between government and non-governmental organizations? Yes? More or less?
So there's no agreement per se, but I think probably the best way to explain it is you have to go back to how societies function. So why did we require state in the first place? Was to assure our rights and freedoms and everything else. And then the markets came in, and the markets, the business, the corporate, the business were entrepreneurship and everything else. But then people realized there were people who were being left behind.
Sure.
And those people who are being left behind organized themselves into what is now called the civil society groups.
Yes.
And the civil society groups really exist because of government failure and market failure. So you have to look at it from that perspective, that actually civil societies exist where there is government failure and where there is market failure, or both. And that's why if the government did its work, or if the leaders that we elect did their work very well in pushing the government of the day to do their work, there would be no need for civil society organizations.
Indeed.
But it's because the government fails, and because the markets fail and the governments fail to regulate the markets where they fail, for example, on labor and everything else, then the civil societies are necessary. So to be honest, I think you can look at the thriving of the civil society organizations as a very, very good indicator of government failure. And I think for me, that's why we have to put the drought and the people facing hunger crisis and the starvations at the door of the state.
Absolutely. So now, should the lobbying then be for government then to reduce on this failure index when it comes to the things that we see? There's a drought. We're not saying geographically stop the drought, but we're saying there are mitigating factors that you can then implement to make sure that in the coming years, people are not as hungry as they were. Can we say, sure, if we're going to now move from rain-fed agriculture to irrigation agriculture, so for me then, because it brought to the doorstep advocacy, lobbying, insistence on government to actually do its job. I see that as a big job of, civil society, NGOs. However, we also see that NGOs do step in and help. There's relief food and things like that, which in my opinion is not sustainable. You can only do that for so long. The long-term effect is what has to come into play here, where it's saying government
must do what you need to do.
Absolutely.
But you know what, Ndu? NGOs thrive in the failure of government.
Without the failure of government, NGOs then will not exist.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think the paradox you have to look here.
This accusation has actually been made. I mean, you hear it all the time.
Yes.
As Oxfam, you hear it all the time. You guys are thriving because, of course, the government is behaving the way it's behaving. When the government comes out and says, we declare the current drought a national disaster and we need 6 billion shillings, the government has put aside 2 billion shillings. The other 4 billion shillings will come from our friends and blah, blah, development partners. They're basically looking at you and saying, and you are very quick to say, oh, yeah, we'll mobilize. We'll be able to put in 2 billion immediately and we'll look for the other. So you have made the government get used to, we've got someone who's going to come and help. You are very active on the ground. And also, it's making the government feel, well, you're okay.
So there's a paradox, and I think we were discussing this the other day, last week, about every time NGOs step in to save lives. And I think when you look at the current ongoing drought with a 5th consecutive failed season, we would have had deaths were it not for the NGOs doing responses already. And this is the UN system, international non-governmental organizations, but also the local actors like ASAL Humanitarian Network. Because of the amazing work they've done, we've actually prevented deaths. But the problem of coming in and doing that and actually saving it being a crisis, the government then opts out of doing its duty and responsibility. And I think for me, I go back to Muga's point, because this is where the local leadership would really matter and would really step up to be counted. But as long as they do not step up to be counted, as long as they do not step up to demand that the government takes their due responsibility, then they expose people to death, but then the NGO and the international community, whether the UN system, the NGOs or local actors, come in and save lives. And because they are doing that, the government can allocate 5 more billion to the office of the president, as opposed to actually saying, oh, let's prioritize the humanitarian response. So you see a displacement effect, and it's a catch-22 situation. What do we do? And I think for me, as Oxfam, we've been trying to push for the governance to work. So accountable governance. So both from taxation, let's tax the rich, let's make sure that we are doing redistribution, let's focus on saving lives, but also let's support communities too, to build more resilient livelihoods. But also the humanitarian response must be locally led. And the beauty of a locally led humanitarian response is actually now you bring in both the private sector, you bring in the local government, the county government for this matter, and you bring in the local civil society organizations. And these are community groups that will always be there. So there will always be civil society organizations. And I think for me, the local, they are the better. But the role of NGOs, I think for me, should shift towards actually advocating for the government to do what it's their duty to do, especially in a country like Kenya.
How bad does it have to get? Before you answer that question, look at countries from which a lot of these NGOs sprout. They're domiciled in these countries. They've got financial muscle. They don't have hunger issues. NGOs do not assist or support in economies or in countries where they flourish. You're not going to find Oxfam, for example, doing the bulk of its work in the Americas. I mean, it's clear why. Now, how bad does it have to get before local leaders then actually do something about the situation? And we're talking about lobbying at the doorstep. How bad? Because usually we see the bulk of action when things have actually hit bottom level. We're at ground zero. We're at ground zero, and that's when we start to see some action. That's when local leaders will then say, okay, hold on a minute, actually it's really bad. But that's the question. This thing that we're saying needs to shift, whereby it's no longer handing out of relief food. It's no longer saying, okay, let's step in. It's actually getting leaders to lobby and say something has to be done about our agricultural practices. Something has to be done about lobbying for the budget to move from centrality out into the counties. How bad does that situation have to get before that is actually then done?
I think the way Kenya really, and often everybody really looks at disaster management is just ad hoc. So if at that local level, planning was done well, disaster management frameworks were up to date, the indicators that really show us that situations are moving from this are already being monitored. It's very clear. They can be able to easily say this ward is more affected than this kind of thing. But they don't have to wait, because even at county government level, around 2% of their budget is for doing contingency funds. Each of the different counties have that mandate. But the key aspect of the leaders, once we vote them in, they come to Nairobi, and that will be my key catch with them. I'm going to look for them seriously, is that because of the pressure and the level of engagement that is down there, they seem to be missing action at the grassroots level. And because of that pressure piling to a level where they are mostly found in Nairobi, this is the major problem. And they're only visible and voices are heard when the crisis is at its peak.
Or during election
time when they really need the votes. Thereafter, you see them the next after the other 5 years. So the shift needs to happen from the way ad hocly we are really engaging with this kind of thing to a more county-based, county-led, county processes that now can easily be able to be identifying the gaps, which each of the different members at the lower level can really plug in into. The amount of resources that are coming to the counties, which is 15%, and you really can hear now already there's a lot of argument about, is it 420 billion? Is it 300 and something what's available? Even it's not the 15%, should be able to be available at the very beginning to be able to really do the actions that are required at the county level. And with that is the only way that we will be able to see the real change happening because of devolution and the ability. By the way, there's another major problem that I see. Because of these clan structures again at the lower level, the moment you start engaging with criticism and pushing and this, it takes a very different dimension. But what is critical is you have been elected, you have been put on that table by the people, you must be available 24 hours round the clock, 7 days a week, and 365. You have been sent out there to do legislation, follow up, and hold government to account and oversight it. Where things are really not working, they need to call it out. Then, whether you are in opposition, whether you are in government, the person who really voted for you really matters. And my call to them is that time is up. And time is now for them to really be able to push this bar to the next level, and we'll be coming to look for them, to engage them in those roundtables on a daily basis.
No, I just wanted to say, from a political perspective, we are a country that have lost our way. And I think we, as I said earlier, I think the drought, the hunger crisis and everything else is a political failure. And I think, as Ahmed is saying, we can actually attribute most of the political failure to the quality of the leaders that we elect. Because I think there's a huge focus on very arbitrary qualities of our leaders. Your clan, your oratory skills, your mobilization and organizational skills, and very little focus on the ideological underpinnings of our political leaders. And that's why they have no idea what they should be lobbying for. They probably have no idea that actually the state is supposed to be a welfare state. That's why we need to have a welfare state, and then that's the only state that functions. The ideological underpinnings of our leaders is one thing, if it exists at all. And because they are lost in terms of just standing up to lobby and to push for the government to do their duty, then we see this massive political failure that led extreme inequality.
You see, our pushback to what you've just said is, there is the duty of the citizenry to oversight their leaders. After all, our constitution tells us we are the boss. These are our servants, these are our workers, it tells us. But have we actually even internalized it and understood the power we actually have? You see, if you do the maths, just simple arithmetic, 2021, 2022, we are informed that we spent 352 billion shillings given to the counties. If I just use that as a point of reference and say that was for one funding cycle, let's do it times 10, that's 3.5 trillion shillings, just for an example. Supposed to be the budget of the country for a year. Do we look at our counties and we see 3.5 trillion having been spent in totality? Whatever location counties are given, is it representative? Because people keep saying, oh, they pay salaries. Yes, if they pay salaries, then people do something with those salaries to better their lives, isn't it? So, across board, do you see this money as being transformative?
So what do you see? Because don't just look at the 350 per year.
Yes.
Look at the 3 trillion per year. Because counties are also where the national government money gets spent. So 3 trillion times 10. Do you see 30 trillion shillings?
Oh, no, I definitely don't. In fact, if you asked me, I would say that the discussion around the money, if you wanted to understand it in a way that could be satisfactory, you'd say it's voodoo, meaning it's all up in the air and it disappears and it's there in figures, but you never really quite see it.
But it's an economy, and I think when you look at our economy, the World Bank says it's an economy that's growing, but not creating jobs.
Forget World Bank. World Bank, let's pause World Bank for a single second. These things they keep telling us are nice to read, and they make good sense in the head. But I am not shutting you down. I'm simply saying, let's leave World Bank out of this discussion for the time being.
Okay, let's leave World Bank then.
In this sense,
when you look at the GDP for Kenya,
no. I'm not
grows.
No. I'm not going GDP even. I don't want to go to GDP. That's a very high-flung discussion.
The local.
But you want to know where the money is going.
No. You have to. No. I don't even want to know where the money is going because I know where it's going. I know exactly where the money is going.
Okay, what's your point?
My point is, how do we get our people to understand the power that they have in determining their futures and their lives? Because if this Mwananchi understands that, and in the collaborations and the caucus that Brother Abdi here has, the people you work with, this thing we are saying becomes a reality because then they will know what to do to ensure this happens. It won't be a discussion and leaving Mheshimiwa to do what he wants or how he wants it. This is really what I'm getting at, because they will then focus on what they need. When you're told you need a dam, we'll say, no, we need a water pan. When they say we will need a smaller dam, say, no, what we need is how to harvest the rain that we have. Say there's no rain, say no, but why don't we find water? Because we do have aquifers, we do have water which doesn't necessarily come from rain. These are the realistic discussions we ought to have. I'm in the ASAL area. What's our main product? We have livestock. Are the abattoirs that were promised, planned for, are they there? Should they not be there? These discussions are the discussions that bring about change. But I want to move away from the economic discussions which are academic, because those ones, as I said, they are good to hear and they're good to listen to and they're good for discussions. But we have these discussions and people are dying of hunger every single day.
Absolutely. Now, I think the problem with the discussion that you're talking about lacks in our politics. And I think for me, it's after 60 years of tribal politics, how do we make our politics issue-based? How do we have conversations around the qualities of leaders we elect, around the politics of and the policies of this country, around the issues like the drought, the hunger crisis, the food security, our agricultural policy, water security, without necessarily electing just leaders because they belong from our clan or our tribe. But I think also not necessarily dismissing the GDP conversations, because, yes, as an economy, we look like we are growing, but we are an economy that's growing without creating jobs. I think for me, it still matters. And we have our conversations around how do we grow an inclusive economic growth, or is it actually growing, or is it the government just spending on major infrastructure and therefore a pseudo growth of our GDP? I think all these figures matter.
And it's a conversation that needs to be had.
Yes.